18th century was an age of elegance, symbolised by genteel Bath. A newly wealthy squirearchy built the classical houses and gardens we still love to visit, and it was also the golden age of English art. Gainsborough, Constable, Turner and Joshua Reynolds painted portraits and landscapes for the new moneyed classes. To get to the top of the artistic tree with paintings like these meant a rigorous apprenticeship at the Royal Academy. The training centred on drawing and painting the human form. But the people who really suffered for their art were the artists' models. This worst job meant a chilly working life spent in the most unusual positions. They would be strung up for hours and hours with nothing to eat or drink, literally strung up on these things. Why, Martin?
Well, it looks like an instrument of torture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the idea was actually to help the model, so that the model could, because, as you say, he'd be there for a long time. And so he could keep the pose, keep still, and not wobble or even fall over.
The Georgian artists were sticklers for accuracy and were taught through formulaic poses. But the poor artist's model would have to hold this pose for several hours, night after night after night.
The thing to think about when you're looking at Tony is you must think of Tony as a god, and really he is the male ideal. This is the perfect man, okay? So that's what you have to think. It's not one individual man. He is Apollo, he is Hercules, he is whatever you want him to be.
Why were they so obsessed by this idea of the classical physique?
Well, they were looking back to the Renaissance, they were looking back to the classical world. The male was the kind of supermodel in a sense. The female wasn't regarded in quite the same light. It was in a sense a projection of male moral perfection too. So you are in a sense the kind of focal point of all those ideas, and they're all coming into play here. Of course, in the 18th century, the male models would have been soldiers, boxers. In fact, one of the most famous male models in the 18th century was a man called George White, Old George. Old George was famous because he had a great figure, great muscles, but he also had a big bushy beard as well, so he could actually play patriarchs and saints, etc. And he was found in a fever hospital. He was used at the academy. He went to live with Hunter. He was also used to do anatomical demonstrations too. And then, like most of these people, he just disappeared back into the undergrowth and was never seen again.
Modelling could mean survival for a poverty-stricken man like George, but it was hard-earned money.
Are you still comfortable?
I'm very cold, actually. Normally, when you're cold, the first thing that you do is huddle your limbs together, isn't it? That's the one thing that you can't do.
Yes.
And because the other thing is that my little finger has completely gone to sleep because of the pressure from the rope. I mean, this may not look a particularly bizarre position, but it's not one that my body is particularly used to. I could do this for half an hour, but 8 hours?
8 hours is asking...
That would be torture, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Really torture.
Yes, you do yourself a nasty injury, I think.
The job may have been done by men down on their luck, but at least it wasn't considered shameful. For a woman, modelling was deemed worse than prostitution. It was like being in some hardcore porn film, your degradation preserved for all time. The fact that a woman had more to lose by posing naked was reflected in the pay.
You got a shilling at the end of the evening for 2 hours. If you were a woman, however, if you were the female model, you would get half a guinea for the evening, which is a big difference. But that was very much the idea that this was shame money, because the only women who would do it would be those who really were desperate for the money. It was something that you did very much as a last resort, and even prostitutes looked upon it as a last resort.
Do we know the names of any of the female models?
The women were anonymous. There is an exception. Her name was Bet Balmano, and she was a prostitute, and she worked for a brothel in London run by one Mrs. Lobb. And we know this because there's a wonderful story about Mrs. Lobb turning up on the doorstep of the sculptor Nollekens and berating him because Bet Balmano had been posing nude to Nollekens for about 8 hours without anything to eat, anything to drink, and at the end of it all he paid her only 2 shillings.
It's ironic that it was this perfect ideal, and they got dossers and prostitutes to recreate it for them.
Yeah, exactly. Especially with the women. The only woman who would do it, who would play a Venus, who would play a goddess, was somebody that morally would be regarded as totally bankrupt.
And here he is in this classic painting, old George from the Fever Hospital, made immortal by Joshua Reynolds. The Georgians lived in an age of confidence and discovery. Anatomists pioneered our understanding of the human body, while inventors like James Watt powered the start of the Industrial Revolution. And in Jane Austen's genteel Bath, people sipped an exotic new Indian beverage. But all this elegance was a bit of a facade. Respectable Georgian society was actually built on a bit of a crime wave. To get from London to Bath, you had to run the gamut of highwaymen. The anatomists only got their medical knowledge from the bodies that were stolen for them by the body snatchers. Even the tea the Georgians drank was more than likely illegal contraband. Which brings me to my next worst job, the riding officer. And as you listen to this sorry tale, please don't let your sympathy be swayed by the fact that he's a distant forerunner of today's VAT man. With tax on over 2,000 imported items, smuggling became big business. A range of goods was brought in from the continent. A major item of contraband was tea. 3/4 of it came in through the back door. To stop the flow, the Customs and Excise had boats patrolling the waters looking for smuggling vessels. Guarding the coast, the last line of defence was the riding officer. A riding officer did just that. He rowed along the coast looking for smugglers rowing out to big ships offshore. There was one for every 10 miles of the English coast, one for every 4 miles where the traffic was thickest. And given that smugglers deliberately chose the worst nights of the year to work for cover, the riding officer had to spend all his time doing a night shift in the cold and wet and raging storms. And that was the easy part. The difficult bit started when he saw that telltale light offshore. There was nothing glamorous about being one lone officer with only a pistol and cutlass against heavily armed criminal gangs supported by the whole community. If our riding officer was galloping across the rocks and he cornered the scurvy smugglers, what would he have done next?
I think you've got the wrong impression here. It's not one man and, a couple of old ladies out there smuggling. We'll be facing a gang, 40, 50, perhaps 100 more of well-armed smugglers, armed to the teeth. And people want to get the goods away, and they're not going to let people stand in the way.
Did smugglers actually use violence on the riding officers?
Yes, all the time. They would use violence really on anybody who got involved, who was likely to affect their trade.
So what did they do to the riding officers?
Well, if they caught them, they suffered quite severely. There's one example of a riding officer who was murdered at this particular time. Another man called May in Cork in Ireland, he has his tongue cut out and his ears, one of which is nailed on the wall of the exchange. He's later found dead. Murder.
So, didn't the riding officers have any backup?
They did. They had people at sea, colleagues at sea. They sometimes had the dragoons on the shore, but this is an age when it's very difficult to communicate. You couldn't pick up your mobile phone and say, hey, we need you all down here, and the helicopter flies in or whatever. This is a question of really trying to organise people in a really distant and murky way.
But surely there must have been times when the authorities would have put the screws on and they had to deliver some contraband or something.
Yeah, but it's actually quite difficult to gain a conviction. The local jury is likely to be packed with sympathisers. JPs are involved quite often in the whole business, and you've got to prosecute the people at your own expense. It's often not worth your while trying.
So we're not talking about rosy-cheeked villagers smuggling a bottle of Spanish brandy. We're talking about organised crime.
This is very much organised crime. There's a lot of money involved, and everybody in the village is likely to be involved in one way or another.
The riding officer was a social pariah, met by a sullen wall of silence when he tried to do his job. But the community had a lot to lose. In the 18th century, Robin Hood's Bay was rumoured to be the wealthiest area in Britain for its size. This must also have been galling for the riding officer, who earned not much more than a farm labourer. And he had to pay for his horse.
people who lived here, they earned their living by the sea. They were insular, they were close-knit, they were ship owners, they worked the ships, they fished. They were naturally suspicious of outsiders, and something like a riding officer who was coming in to curtail one of their sources of income was certainly not a popular person.
The smugglers used their local knowledge to outwit the riding officer, transporting goods through a network of connecting tunnels and passages. Even when the excise did manage a seizure, they were outmanoeuvred. In Robin Hood's Bay in 1779, the riding officer, accompanied by dragoons, captured over 200 casks of brandy and gin with 150 chests of tea. The town called on the crew of a smuggling vessel. After a pitched battle, the smugglers seized back the contraband. So the work of the riding officer had very little effect. The 18th century was also the age of landscape art. Designers like Capability Brown changed the course of rivers and moved mountains to redraw the English countryside. Now, he was at the top. At the bottom, lurking in the undergrowth, my next worst job. I'm now a hermit, putting the finishing touch to this beautifully sculptured garden. All I have to do is stay in my cave and not speak to anyone or have a bath or cut my hair or cut my nails or have a wash. And at the end of 7 years, and only at the end of 7 years, I get paid. And believe it or not, this craze for having a hermit at the bottom of your posh garden lasted for 100 years. Now sod off, because I'm not allowed to speak to anyone. Smelly, bearded recluses had a strong pull on the 18th century imagination, symbolising all that was unworldly and spiritual. Rich Georgians liked to show the world they still had a soul, but too busy to withdraw in contemplation, they hired eccentrics, romantics and misfits to do it for them. I'm still being a hermit, although quite frankly I don't like it very much. Mind you, at least I'm above ground. One hermit was forced to live underground, although for some reason he wasn't allowed to take his organ with him. Another one was told that he wasn't even allowed to speak to the servants who gave him his food, and another was told that every time one of the guests came by, he had to go like this. But the thing that would have really hacked me off is that you had to keep on doing all this hermity stuff, even when the people who lived in the big house had gone away on holiday. Back in the 18th century, taking the waters was all the rage. Thanks. It does taste a bit foul, but they also used to bathe in it. It was supposed to soothe the gout, help cure the pox, and calm scrofulous skin, which brings me to my next worst Georgian job, the bath attendant. It may look like a glamorous workplace, but the bath attendants spent their whole working day up to their necks in this mineral stew. They were at the beck and call of pox-ridden clients who had to be lifted from their sedan chairs into the steaming waters. But what really makes it a worse job for me is the uniform.
The idea of wearing for an entire day, maybe 10, 12 hours, worth of wearing wet canvas clothing, it would have been incredibly uncomfortable. On their heads they wore a hat, and from 1737 all the bath guides, by the Bath Council orders, had to actually have a tassel on their hats so they could actually be noticed and recognised in the water. And
so would the bathing attendants actually have had to lower them into the water?
Probably, with some people, certainly. Some people were very fit and they were only coming really for social affairs and just to have fun. But if you were very ill, then you would have actually tried to be manoeuvred to some place where you could either sort of sit or sort of stand or hold on to one of these iron rings.
How did you hold on to the ring when you've got the water down here?
You wouldn't have been able to do it if it had been right at that level. But if you look at the wall here, and you see the colour of the stone, this is from the staining of the water
So
from the
that was
Georgian
the
period.
water level?
That's right, yeah. So if you see the height that you and I are standing, we would have been barely above the water. Even if we would have sat on one of these seats. Yes, you would still been sitting
Your head
like
would be
this.
just sticking out, wouldn't
Exactly,
it?
yeah. And so you can see why people did hold on like that.
So was the water this colour?
No, the water isn't quite that colour. It'd be the colour that it is today, more or less. But because it's got such a high iron content in it, as soon as it's here for any period of time, it stains the walls. But if you think about somebody who's actually a bath guide, who's in this water, day in, day out, day in, day out, you can see why the 18th century types who came visiting used to say these people with lacquered hides, and describing the bath guides as if their skin itself had been turned this sort of strange orange, as if they'd done too much fake tanning.
There were only 12 guides to look after about 60 bathers in an era when people couldn't swim. And despite the presence of a sergeant at arms, the atmosphere was often unruly, with young boys dive-bombing into the water. And the bath attendant had to handle people with hideous diseases.
Some of the ailments would have been particularly nasty because you're dealing with a society when you're looking at mixing people with open sores and open wounds and ulcers, all kinds of different skin ailments that would have all been in here bathing indiscriminately.
So it's a kind of gravy of human detritus.
Yes, exactly, yes. And the 18th century contemporaries often commented on that, and it's often talked about having a filthy scum on the top of it. The bath guides have to sort of stay on and help clean out the pool afterwards.
It's not a great job, is it?
No, not at all.
I'm doing all right. I've already been here 2 hours. I've only got another 6 years, 364 days, 22 hours to go, and then I'll get a pension of £50 per year. I'm a bit nippy, so's my skull, but at least I'm physically intact, which is more than can be said for the person doing my next worst job. Does Robbie Williams have a bad job? No, nor Will Young. But the pop stars of the 18th century had a tougher time. They were superstars of the new craze of opera. But the price of their success was having to undergo the barbaric practice of castration. Dr. Peter Giles sings countertenor, the nearest we can get today to the sound of the castrato, but he admits it's a pale imitation. Who were the castrati?
They're a whole breed of super male singers, and they came from the ranks of usually choir boys in Italy, and it nearly all happened in Italy.
Why did they castrate these boys?
Well, it stops the normal process of puberty. And it's got to be done when the boy is 8 or 9, not much more. And it stops what happens, obviously, from the testicles. The testosterone starts to move in and change the whole body from a boy into a man. It's got to be done before the boy gets too old. Of course, they didn't do it to just any boy. The boys had to be already singing very well.
So castration didn't make you a good singer?
Oh, no. All it did was to preserve that high pitch.
Did it hurt?
I think it did. There were various ways that they did it. One of the ways was to put the boy in very, very hot water. This was full of various herbs and spices, and they would be given alcohol and drugged. They would then manipulate the testicles until they wore down. It sounds awful, but the kid
What do you mean wore down?
Well, they wore down. They broke down their structure, and because they were only young, it just destroyed the function. And then, of course, once they've done that, they can cut the spermatic cord. There are clippers and all sorts of things that they used to use. It was just awful.
18th century observers didn't care about the downsides of being a castrato. They raved about them having the voices of angels.
The variety of it was incredible, and a lot of the most important music, which we associate now perhaps with female voices, was actually written not for female voices at all, but for castrati. The big period for it was between 1650 and 1750. But it went on and on and on. And I bet you don't realise when the last one died, 1922. Yeah, 1922. Alessandro Moreschi. and he was the last castrato of the Sistine Chapel.
It's not a very good recording. Moreschi was past it and was never of the first rank anyway, but it does give you an idea of the unearthly quality of the castrato.
Back in the 18th century, they would shout out, "Evviva il coltello!" Long live the knife! They would, because they just couldn't believe how wonderful these singers were.
But only the top castrati had fame and fortune. Out of 4,000 boys castrated every year, perhaps 1% made it. 99% were sad failures. Worse still, they looked like freaks. Castrati tended to be abnormally tall, obese, and with no body hair.
Some of them, of course, were absolutely wonderful singers. Others were a bit ordinary, and others were total failures. And some died. A really bad deal. You couldn't have a normal, ordinary family life, of course. You run the risk of disease, premature disease. You could be very badly deformed. You had all sorts of difficulties of that sort, but musically, if you were of the top draw, you were laughing. When you were a choir boy, if you were a good soloist and showed aptitude, yes, you might very well have been one of those boys back in the 18th century, as I might have been. But luckily, we didn't live in that period, and we didn't live in Italy.
What an intense relief.
Like as the heart desireth the water brooks, so longeth my soul after thee, O God.
And I've still got my testicles. Britain really did rule the waves in Georgian times, thanks to Nelson's victory at Trafalgar. As we continued to fight France and Spain, the contemporary song Rule Britannia summed up Britain's determination never to be slaves. Others weren't so lucky. This was also the time of the slave trade. Thousands of captured Africans were shipped in horrifying conditions across the Atlantic via ports like Liverpool and Bristol to work in the American plantations. We can't do justice to their lives. Worse jobs implies at least some element of freedom, and of course they had none. But we can see where some of them ended up, because when the British finally came to their senses and abolished slavery, the British Navy was sent into the Atlantic to try to intercept some of the French and Spanish slave ships. Some of the liberated slaves ended up enlisting in the ships that had saved them. Once aboard, they joined sailors from many different races and also a number of women. Most of them can't have known what they were letting themselves in for. Although nothing was as bad as slavery, Britannia's rule of the waves was maintained by a whole host of terrible jobs in ships like this. Life was so tough that British recruits had to be dragged on board by the press gang, and captains were frequently offered prisoners, debtors and patients. Richard, if I was a raw recruit fresh on your ship, what kind of tasks would you give me to do?
Well, the press gang isn't giving me the seamen I want anymore, and the quota acts are pulling in every vagrant and ne'er-do-well from all corners of the kingdom, and you look like a landsman to me.
Oh yeah, I'm a landsman.
I think you'd probably be a waster.
I'm not, I work really hard.
I know you do, yes, but wasters are the people with no nautical skills, and we give the really dull, thick duties in the middle of the ship under supervision.
Oh yeah.
So what did you do when you were ashore?
I'm an actor and a writer and a television
So you can read and
presenter.
write?
Oh yeah.
Well, I think we could turn you into a surgeon's assistant and start you off as a lob-lolly boy.
Where do I go for that?
Down below.
The Historical Maritime Society has developed a unique way of demonstrating the primitive nature of surgery at sea using fake blood and pork belly. For the lob-lolly boy, having to witness these barbaric operations must have been one of the worst parts of the job. Carl's a lob-lolly boy, isn't he? What's he doing?
He is. Effectively, he's a manual assistant to the surgeon. His main task, is, as you can see him now, is to hold the patient steady while I'm trying to remove this musket ball from him.
And what do you want me to do?
If you can, I'd like you to hold his legs. I think the pain may bite in fairly shortly.
What's this op?
I'm trying to locate a musket ball. The patient's been hit from the front and the ball has travelled through. I can feel it, I just can't get hold of the ball. Now, I'm trying my best to get the ball out with my fingers.
Yeah.
I can feel it just below the line here, but I'm trying desperately to avoid the spine.
Why is a loblolly boy called a loblolly?
It's an allusion to the colloquial name or slang name for what we call portable soup. It's derived from that.
It's not soup.
No, it's a lozenge. It's a rendered lozenge of animal matter mixed with vegetal matter.
It smells like a rancid OXO cube.
Absolutely, and it keeps for years.
So basically what you're doing is feeding the sick consommé.
Exactly. Yeah.
How are you getting on?
Yeah, it's a struggle. It's coming.
Yeah.
Hold him.
He's really twitching now. Hang on, Carl. Whoa! Hey, there we've got him. Hang on, he's rolling around on the floor. Blimey, I thought it was a tiny little bullet. No wonder you were having problems getting it out. Oh, that must have hurt. Mind you, presumably, there wasn't any way of deadening the pain, no anaesthetic or anything.
None at all. We like to keep the patients awake because we have no way of monitoring them if they fall into coma or whatsoever.
So how did they cope with the pain?
They quite literally, the term is bite the bullet, but we don't give them bullets, they bite on a piece of leather. And it just gives them their mouth something else to do other than scream.
I don't know if he's laughing, but he's definitely shaking down here. I think you've cured him. You're right. He's got a case of very bad acting.
Could you make yourself useful?
Bit of a problem, aren't you? The loblolly boy also got the job of rounding up the amputated limbs and tossing them overboard. But although his job must have been bloody and depressing, at least he avoided some of the other horrors of life on deck.
What are you going to do now?
I don't know, you tell me.
I think it's about time we turned you into a topman.
What's that?
Topman's a very important member of the ship's crew. All the manoeuvring on the ship requires handling the ropes, heaving the braces, trimming the sheets. And a lot of it's done aloft.
Aloft means up there?
Aloft means up there, so I think we better show you the ropes.
Is that what the expression means?
Absolutely, yes. And I think you should go up to the main top and see how you get on up the rigging. You've got to start by climbing up on the carronade, over the hammock netting.
Hang on, onto here?
Yep.
Yeah.
Over the hammock netting.
Yeah.
And into the shrouds. And those thin ropes are the ratlins.
Yeah.
Up you go. All the way up to the main top above you.
What's that platform?
That's right. Now, when you get up to the top, there are two ways of handling it. One, you can go through the lubber's hole close to the mast. And that's a bit dishonourable, but it's your first time. Or you can go over the futtocks, which means climbing out backwards and hanging out over the deck and going round the outside.
I think I'll miss out on the futtocks. This is for real?
This is for real. Good luck.
I don't know if I can do this.
Yes, you can.
I had it a bit easier than in the 18th century. I got to climb up the rope ladder rather than the ratlins. But it was still precarious. I know the sensible thing is not to look down, but the problem is you get your feet jammed on the bits of rope. And so you're forced to look down, but then every time you look down, you can see quite how... Oh, God, I'm only less than halfway. Oh, I'm slowing down now. I think it's tiredness, it's just fear. Hard to believe that when they used to do this, they'd be on a grog ration of something like half a pint of rum mixed with water. So they'd be climbing up like this on the equivalent, oh God, of about 12 rum and cokes. Oh, I don't like this bit. I can't get my foot in there. Rung. Just feel as though I'm not very secure at all. I feel very sick. And shaky. It swings out here every time you do a step. Oh, lordy, 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 lordy. It's so steep. Quite know how to get on. Oh, I've done it. That is by far the most frightening thing I've ever done in my life. I'm bloody glad I've done it, though. It's extraordinary to think that the guys who were doing that could have been doing it in a storm with the boat pitching and tossing and tossing and pitching, and then when they got up here, they might well be asked, do you see that thing over there, that yard arm? They'd have been asked to go along there in order to furl or unfurl something. In fact, my legs are shaking so much I'm just going to sit down for a bit. That was bloody scary. In reality, a top man would have had to get up there in under a minute. I took 5 times that getting down, and I didn't have to untie and haul up the rigging.
Well done. I think we'll have to rate you able seaman after that.
I think you should make me an admiral for that.
And imagine what it would have been like if you hadn't just been in the main top, but you'd been out on the main yard somewhere. Well, you've done very well. Very well indeed.
I'm a bit pleased with myself. After that, I really needed my grog ration. The good news about the food is that there's plenty of it. You have it in this square thing, so you actually get a square meal, and the drink is this half rum, half water cocktail, which is remarkably good. The meat on this plate is this stuff, which is salt pork, which you soak to get rid of all the salt and then cook it up. Well, very, very, very salty, but it's bearable. And the biscuit to go with it, it's not that nice actually, is this thing. It really is hard tack, and the real problem with it is, can you see those little holes in there? After a while, when you've been at sea a few months, it gets riddled with these little beetles. You can just about see one there. You can see them. This food really is quite disgusting, but you can see the beetles crawling around in there. And the biscuit is so hard that you have to soak it in this gravy. Actually, there's not much gravy. It's all kind of congealed fat and God knows what. And then take a bite, and I think I've got about 17 beetles in here. It's quite disgusting. It's not nice at all.
2, 6,
At one time, the Navy was fighting the Spanish, the Dutch, the Russians and the Americans. So Action Stations was the cue for an even worse job in the Navy, the gunner. British gun crews were pushed hard. They had to fire at 3 times the rate of the opposition. This made them more vulnerable to accidents, causing horrific injuries and death. What other dangers were there in the battle?
One of the most dangerous things would be a ball hitting the side of the ship. When that happens, the inside of the ship erupts in a great shower of splinters. Some of them could be 6 foot long. So far more injuries caused by that than by a cannonball itself hitting you. Splinters were the real dangerous things. If any of these ropes were severed, one of these cannons could break loose. Now, if there's a heavy sea, that could also be another problem.
That'd be lethal. I mean, I've seen what a dead weight these things are.
That's obviously the origin of the phrase, a loose cannon, because that would cause so much damage rolling around inside the ship.
During a naval battle, this would have been a terrible place to be. Ships often used to fight yard arm to yard arm and pound each other, so the cannonballs would be smashing right into the opposite gun room. What could be worse than being a man doing this kind of back-breaking job at the height of battle on a deck drenched in blood? Well, being a boy doing pretty much the same thing, I suppose. Believe it or not, there were boys as young as 6 or 7 doing one of the most dangerous jobs of all on a ship, being a powder monkey. But it wasn't just boys, was it, Jenny?
No, there were women on board ship, and anyone who wasn't involved in the actual manning of the guns would be helping in some way, running the powder from the magazine.
How do we know that?
Well, there were contemporary accounts, but also when there was a naval service medal issued for Nile and Trafalgar, then a lot of women came forward to try and claim that medal, but were refused.
Come and show me what they did. So what did the powder monkeys actually do?
Well, you need to carry the powder from the magazine, which is right down the bottom of the ship, as fast as possible up to the guns and the gun crews.
Were there many powder monkeys doing this?
There were quite a few powder monkeys, but you have to do it in relays, so there would be a continual stream of people coming down to the magazine and up to the guns.
And they'd be carrying it in this?
Yes, a powder keg.
And this presumably protects it from sparks?
Yeah. If there's a spark anywhere, it will obviously explode, and so you're not trailing gunpowder through the ship. And when you get there, it's kind of secure until you actually need the powder.
So where were they running from?
From the powder magazine.
Down
so
here?
you better go, yeah.
It's quite a way, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Down here?
Yes. And here's the powder keg. You need to go and get that filled up.
There's a bloke down here.
Yes, that's a Marine, and he's there to stop any unauthorised people coming into the magazine.
But I'm authorised.
Oh, yes.
Morning. Right, what do I do?
Come in. Right, put that down. We'll refill that. So stop filling that up with cartridges.
Why are these walls copper-lined?
Copper-lined for two reasons. First of all, moisture. We're below the waterline here, and we need to avoid moisture getting in here. Water and black powder don't mix. It stops the black powder functioning. And secondly, to avoid sparks. Copper doesn't spark like iron. Spark in here, and we'd all end up in heaven very quickly.
Right, I'm full.
OK, get back up to those guns.
OK.
Hurry up, man.
During the Battle of the Nile, one French ship, the Orient, was blown to Kingdom Come when a red-hot cannonball rolled into the powder room. For the powder monkey, speed was of the essence. Not easy during a battle when the deck would have been sanded to soak up the blood. There are stories of naval engagements where blood was literally pouring out of the scuppers. At the Battle of Trafalgar, 1 in 5 of the crew was either killed or wounded. It's carrying deadly gunpowder that could kill everyone amidst the carnage of battle that makes Powder Monkey a worse job for me. That was just one cannon going off. Imagine if they were all going off at once.
Come on, you
and imagine if you were an 8-year-old raw recruit and this was your first time in battle. Mind you, if they did win and you did manage to capture an enemy boat, then the Powder Monkey's got a share in the prize money. I reckon it was that perk rather than patriotism that made the Royal Navy great. Cleaning out a giant bath was messy but relatively safe. Riding officers and powder monkeys may have had risky lives, but at least they had the glory of fighting for king and country. And even the shame of being an artist's model could lead to immortality. No, for me, the very worst job started every morning right here at 6 a.m. And as you can see from the size of the beds, it was a job done by children. It was actually 2 to a bed here, and these kids could only ever dream of becoming powder monkeys. The 18th century saw the birth of the Industrial Revolution that changed Britain forever, but it would never even have got off the ground if it hadn't been for worse jobs like the mule scavenger. Mills like Quarry Bank near Manchester were technological marvels, using first water and then the new medium of steam to power cotton production. But they weren't so forward-thinking about employment. The mill owners here, though by no means the worst, used to buy children as young as 6 from the workhouse for a couple of quid to be apprentices. For not more than board and lodging, they worked at least 12 hours a day.
The very worst job in a factory, right at the bottom of the hierarchy of the mill, was the little scavengers. They were mostly the youngest children. Yeah. And what they had to do was to go underneath this machine.
What, right through the back here?
Yeah.
Oh, keep away from
that. Right under that machine there, while it was working, and clean away all the bits of loose cotton that had fallen down.
It must have been quite dangerous.
Well, it was incredibly dangerous. If you think about it, the early mules couldn't be stopped. You couldn't stop the machine to clean them.
Yeah.
And in any case, the spinners were paid by the piece, so they had no interest in stopping the machine.
I suppose the thing about kids is that they tend not to concentrate and muck about.
Absolutely. Kids and machinery just don't mix.
Yeah.
And after 12 hours of working in this place, you could imagine that children would be tired and inattentive, and it only required 1 second of inattention to get a finger caught in one of these wheels, or to even get squeezed between the carriage and the back of the machinery.
Do we know much about the kind of injuries that they got?
Well, the kind of day-to-day injuries, which in a place like this would have been ranged out from anything from cut fingers to severed hands, quite often would not be recorded, certainly in the Georgian period.
Because they weren't thought important enough.
Well, indeed. For the workers, they were important because clearly, if you lost a hand, you could never work again.
Yeah.
But then, quite often, most of the accidents were regarded as the worker's own fault.
There was only one thing for it. Time to put on my calico trousers and get started on my career as a scavenger. So I'm all kitted up, no shirt, as you can see. It's really hot in here. It can't be much cooler because otherwise these threads can snap. And no shoes either, because normally they'd have worn clogs with metal studs. But if your clog hits part of this machinery, it can cause a spark. And as you can see, there's lots of little bits of fluff in here. And if the spark hit one of those, then woof, the whole thing could go up in flames. So, Peter, I'm ready to go. What do I need to do?
OK, here's your scavenger's brush.
Yep.
And here's your scavenger's sack.
Right.
Now, what you've got to do is to get into this rather cramped space under the machine.
Yeah.
And basically, the job's pretty simple. You've got to brush up all of this waste cotton.
There's a load of muck up here as well, isn't there? It's all stuck all over the machine.
Yeah, well, that's your job too. You've got to brush all that down and make sure that it's not going to contaminate the cotton.
It's incredibly dusty, actually, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Chris, can you start it up? I just want to see how...
You can imagine how dangerous it would be to be cleaning off these wheels as well, you know, and the ropes and the machinery.
Yeah, it would be if your concentration shifted, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
For 12 hours a day, the scavenger needed incredible agility. Today there's an emergency button to stop the machine, but even so, I still had to watch out. Losing your concentration could be fatal, as the memorandum book for the mill records for one accident in Georgian times.
A very melancholy accident befell a lad named Joseph Foden, about 13 years of age. While engaged sweeping under a mule, his head was caught between the roller beam and the carriage, as the latter was putting up, and completely smashed. Death being instantaneous.
Be careful.
It would really take your feet off, wouldn't it? If you were concentrating over this bit here and you got your foot down there.
Yep. Feet, fingers.
The real problem is that there's no even rhythm. It sort of starts off really slowly, and then when it gets to the top, there's this rather unnerving pause, and you're just kind of waiting for it to start again, and you're sort of trying to do as much work as you can to get yourself in position, and then it starts to roll back quite slowly and then gets faster and faster. Do you see how that last bit was a real sprint? So, because there's no steady rhythm, it's hard to work out a steady strategy so that you're always in the right place. And your feet feel incredibly vulnerable for when it comes back behind you. You don't know if you're going to whack them on this thing. So it's actually much more knackering than you'd think it is. It's so knackering. I tell you what it is. If it was a regular rhythm, you could work out how you were going to do it.
Yeah.
But because it's in such jerks, it's like driving a car off-road that you're constantly having to concentrate. So, you know, I imagine what it must have been like for kids, because the moment you let the concentration stop, you lose sync with the rhythm of it. And it's actually the backing out. You see, backing out through here, it's a doddle, isn't it? As long as you know you can go straight back, you're not going to get hurt. Even if you got bumped over the head, you can come out. But get stuck in this stuff here.
Get on one of these things.
Yeah, there's nowhere to go. So for a kid, it's a hell of a job.
Very dangerous.
After 12 hours of back-breaking work on their hands and knees, the children returned to the apprentice house, where they'd be rewarded with a supper of thin gruel and chores before bedtime. Then it was up again at 6 for another day's scavenging. Our modern industrial age was born in places like Quarry Bank, and if it hadn't been for young workers like the doffers and piecers and scavengers doing all the worst jobs, the whole thing would have ground to a halt. And if you think things can only get better, you'd be wrong. Join me next time on the bottom rung of the Victorian jobs ladder. I'll be showing Railtrack what you can do with a gallon of beer and 2 pounds of meat, having my hands full as a rat catcher, and experiencing what may be the worst job of all time. Oh, God!
Stay tuned next hour for another episode of The Worst Jobs in History.